make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
The actual intent to commit genocide, which is usually the most difficult thing to prove. But, in Israel's case, frankly, y'all, this is the first live stream genocide. I mean, frankly, the arguments about where's the intent are nonsensical. I mean, this is the first time we have, in real time, soldiers committing war crimes and broadcasting and celebrating everything from literally dancing around in the lingerie of their sexual and murderous victims. I mean, we are seeing levels of depravity in the IDF and in this genocidal campaign that are absolutely unique in the history of the world.
Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching our YouTube channel, I'm your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Burtram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing great. Thanks, Will.
Hey, and today we have with us Bill Armaline. Nailed it.
No worries. It's spelled like line, so I can't blame you.
Armaline, who is a professor in the Department of Sociology and Interdisciplinary Social Sciences and founder of the Human Rights Minor Program and Human Rights Institute at San Jose State University. And we are just so thrilled to have our very first human rights professor on the show. So welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sean. I'm really honored to be here, and thanks to you and your audience.
Awesome. Do you go by Bill or William?
I go by Bill or Will. Either one's fine.
Okay. I normally go by Will. So if you're more comfortable with Bill,
then works.
Okay, cool. I was really nervous about that going into this. Two Williams in a show. How are we going to work this? No one's ever done this before.
Mind blowing.
So Bill, start us off. What the heck is human rights, or what are human? Is or are human rights? One of those.
Well, yeah. So and maybe this is a good opportunity to kind of tell how I got into the field, because it's actually not a typical path. So we were chatting before we got on record, I don't come from a real highfalutin academic background. I mean, my father became a professor, a little later, and kind of through working class universities like Youngstown State in Ohio, and eventually he was at Ohio State and Toledo and elsewhere. But generally speaking, it's not really my background. I'm from a really working class place and working class family. Most of my family are, either teachers or nurses or, worked for the road crews or, the typical kinds of things that, frankly, folks from Ohio tend to do in the working class and middle class. And so when I went to UConn for my graduate degree, I had an opportunity to take classes with, really high-level scholars in human rights. And I was the first graduate assistant for the HRI at UConn, which is now one of the sort of finest institutes of that kind in the world. And that was a huge learning experience for me. But it was my first exposure to international law. It was my first exposure to human rights. And, to me, as someone who grew up kind of witnessing the kinds of struggles that people go through in our country, particularly in the working class, I didn't frankly see those rights being practiced, right? I didn't see those protections as being real for many people, at least that I had grown up around in the environments that I was used to. But I took the education despite that, right? And I was really thankful for it. But to answer your question directly, so human rights are a body of international law that were created as a part of the efforts to start the United Nations in the late 1940s, right? 1948. It was created actually under the leadership of the United States and other Western powers after the war. All kinds of political and sort of social movement folks that we would recognize from history were involved in those discussions and those debates to create the United Nations and to create the UDHR. And as many people know, right, the UDHR was created also under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt and all these other folks. But W.B. Du Bois was a huge voice in that process. This is really important to understand. And other leaders from other countries, folks from sort of Gandhi's movement in India and elsewhere, were also part of these really long and sort of dynamic debates over what would really become essentially a new global order under U.S. hegemony following the war, right? And the United Nations and human rights law were part of that rules-based order that the United States and other sort of winners out of World War II created in its shadow. So human rights are established through what are called human rights instruments, but you should basically think of them as treaties. I mean, they are legally binding in the same way that treaties are legally binding according to our constitutional law and according to the broader international legal framework. So each of these instruments, right, cover a different area of human rights law. So the UDHR was kind of the initial declaration, and that's what it is, a declaration, but the UDHR actually was not technically binding. So the job after the UDHR was established in 1948 for the next several decades were to create actual binding instruments that would be, enforceable to the extent that these things are enforceable at all. So to just skip to the chase, right? The United States has only ratified 3 of these instruments. And we're an outlier in the world in the sense that we have not ratified several of these, and I can mention those here in a minute. So we have ratified as a nation the ICCPR, which is the instrument on civil and political rights. The reason that we've ratified that one is because, frankly, it's based on our own Bill of Rights. I mean, it's literally based on our Bill of Rights, the droit d'homme, so the Bill of Rights for France, and these other establishing documents from what we call the bourgeois revolutions of the late 1700s, English Revolution, American Revolution, and French Revolution. But we've also ratified CAT, so the Convention Against Torture. We've also surprisingly ratified ICERD, which is the Convention to End All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Now, whether or not we've upheld our obligations to these instruments is another question. But we are an outlier in the sense that we have not ratified instruments like the Conventions on the Rights of the Child, so human rights for kids. Our only company in that are states like Somalia. I mean, there are very few states that join us in that regard. Similarly, though we were the inspiration, under Hillary Clinton and many others for CEDAW, for the Convention Against Discrimination Against Women, we are also not party to that. We're not party to the instrument on migrants, on indigenous, right. So, and we're of course party to like the Genocide Convention, which is important right now for a number of issues, and some of these other conventions. But those are the only instruments that we have ratified as a nation. Now we've signed the ICESCR, which is our civil, economic, and cultural rights, rights to housing, rights to food, these sorts of things, but we have not ratified. And again, we're a major outlier in that sense. Is this answering your question? I don't want to drone on too long. And
it totally does. And just to kind of give you a sense of how little I know about the topic, I swear I have more questions than we have time. So I'm going to try to
ask away.
Try to figure out a way to funnel down everything you just said into maybe something that at least I can understand. So with all these different treaties, conventions, ratification of all these things, number one, what are these pockets of human rights, specifically maybe at the UN, or if there's another body
Sure.
that has them, and how do these sort of focuses or caucuses or whatever you want to call them get formed, Sure. So you mentioned, okay, the US hasn't ratified this one, and this one, but how many are there? And what's sort of the standard practice and the symbolism behind us
for sure having
ratified?
And I can also just get into how does this even work, right? Which I think is also kind of behind your question. And I think a lot of just Americans, for good reason, don't understand, as I didn't either. So just to give you the background, what are these different kind of types of human rights? So they're actually we think of them as generations of rights because they are actually they follow from certain periods of history. So the first gen human rights are civil and political rights, right? Then think of these rights as the ones that draw the line between the rulers and the ruled, right? These are the rights that come from the classic political theories of our classic Western political theorists. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, right? All of these fools that you learn about in your poli-sci classes and some of your intro theory classes and that kind of stuff. So it's from these bourgeois revolutions of the English, French, and American revolutions, but also the political thinkers behind those revolutions, right? And what were all those about? This was the turn away from feudalism and toward these new nation states. This is also the Enlightenment. This is reflecting this period in Western and global history where these notions of like due process, right, notions of protections when it comes to state authority were really established, right, and we have these kinds of notions of rights that come from those struggles and come from those political moments. The second generation of human rights are social and economic rights. Now, these come from the socialist, communist, and anarchist revolutions and movements, but also labor movements and other kinds of folks who were fighting for these kinds of rights throughout mainly the 19th century, the 1800s, but that'll also expand into some areas of the 20th century as well. And so these are rights that are, positive rights to things, right? So the right to housing, the right to food, the right to health and healthcare, the right to education. Right. And, very interestingly, sort of in the history of human rights, the reason that we have two instruments to articulate all of the rights that are our central rights that were established in the UDHR is because of the Cold War. So in the 1970s, when at the United Nations, they were trying to get the world to all agree to the binding nature of these rights, you can imagine what happened. The West all signed on to civil and political rights. And everybody under the communist influence, well, so-called communist influence of the Soviet Union and China and others, they all lined up with the ICESCR, so the social and economic rights. So it's not until basically toward the end of the 20th century that we see everybody ratifying both, again, with us being a notable outlier on one of those two instruments. So kind of an interesting background. And then the third generation is cultural rights. And these actually stem from the anti-colonial movements of the later 20th century. So all over Africa, all over Latin America, all over the Pacific. And cultural rights are actually very few. The main one is the right to sort of the right to one's nation state. So the right to self-determination by a group, by an identifiable nation. And this, of course, as you can imagine, stemmed from the colonized peoples trying to kick out their imperial overlords and saying, now we're our own nation. We don't need you anymore. This kind of a thing. So that's where you hear these three sort of groupings of rights, these generations of human rights. They stem from these various points in history that generated those concepts.
Man, that is really cool to think about that. So like there's this, obviously this kind of complex history behind this declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and certain people have signed on, or certain countries rather, and
Sure.
then certain countries have not. I was looking it up. There's like 30, is that true? 30 articles detailing individuals' basic rights and freedoms.
I mean,
now,
there are
are they in order of like importance? Like it's number 30.
So let me break that down. I totally understand your question. So the way that we think about this, well, first of all, if you ratify it, it's binding regardless, right? It's like any other treaty. Like if you look at our Constitution, right, we have standards for ratification, the votes that have to be met in the houses of Congress, and these sorts of things are 2/3 of the Senate, this kind of stuff, right? But once it's ratified, according to the Constitution, right, it's the law of the land, right? Like direct quote. So that is supposed to be the way that this works. Now, my work is influenced by the fact that the United States has been largely hypocritical in their participation in this as the global hegemon, and frankly, the ones that actually kind of started this to begin with in many ways. And, if you talk to, many members of Congress, many members of our own government, really, frankly, a cross-party, it's more heavily on the right, but it's a cross-party, frankly. What are they going to say? Oh, this is globalism. This is outside interference in U.S. interest. This is all of these things, which on its face, on the history, is nonsensical. Because again, this is literally part of the rules-based order that the United States purposefully put in place to ensure their sort of hegemonic position in the world for decades to come. Now, like other powers, we find ourselves now as a waning empire breaking all of those rules. And that is not unique to us in the history of world orders, right? Just like the British and the Dutch did the same toward the end of their world orders, right? They, and they did things like end slavery, but go full bore into colonization. These kinds of things is not unique to the United States in the history of world orders. But to answer your question directly, Josh, because it's a good one, our central human rights are the human rights from what we call the International Bill of Human Rights. But all the IBHR is think of a triangle. It's the UDHR as the declaration, and then the ICCPR and the ICESCR as the binding treaties that made all of those rights, again, binding according to law. Most of the world, like 95% of the world, has ratified both of those instruments, with a couple outliers, including us. And that's why those are considered the international bill, and those are considered, that list, are fundamental human rights. Now, these other instruments like CEDAW, the ICERD, rights on migrants, rights, those don't actually create new rights. What they do is they articulate how the rights that already exist need to work for these special populations. So let's take it, for instance, like kids, right? There are certain additional questions that arise when we start talking about the rights to children. Think of, for example, rights to family and marriage. Well, when is it okay for a kid to get married?
Yeah.
When is it okay for a kid to work? When is it okay for, and all of these questions are culturally specific, they're contextually specific, and it's a little harder to sort of come up with like, well, this is the clear line. So whether it's the CRC for kids, CEDAW for women, ICERD for racialized populations, what these things do, as again, they don't add new rights. What they do is they talk about how the rights that already exist need to be understood in practice. That way, right, if there's a question of whether or not these rights are being protected by state A, state B, or whatever, there is additional information there, there's additional guidance there on exactly how that's supposed to work out. Similarly, the UN also has really interesting tools that are similar. So, for example, there are standards, like international standards on all kinds of stuff according to our human rights law. So there are, things that I've written about before in other publications, or, our standards for use of force, for policing and things like that. Does it reflect the international standards or a different standard, right? There are all kinds of these other tools, even outside of those instruments, that the United Nations provides that are really useful in that regard.
Man, that's really cool. So if I'm thinking about this and trying to conceptualize this, because I know how important rights are. They're extremely important in our debates. Any constitutional issue, the most controversial ones have to do with rights. Thinking
Sure.
about children's rights, I think automatically about abortion. I think about at what point is a child considered a child? At what point are they given any kind of right to life or anything like that? I'm not asking you necessarily to answer those questions, although
Sure.
you can talk about whatever you want to
Sure.
along those lines. But it's like I just start thinking about that. But how did they come up with these rights? Like, did they look at all the major religions? Did they look at, did they decide, hey, this culture, this is taboo, but this is good, or this conglomeration of nations gives these rights? How do they come up with these rights? What was the moral and philosophical foundation for saying, yeah, these are inherent rights that people have?
It is a very interesting question that you're asking, and it is the classic question that we kind of talk about, sort of the upper level, upper division stuff and grad level when we talk about some of these things, and again, foundations of human rights. And so to answer your question, I would just say yes, all of those things, but that's not a very good answer. So let me drill down a little bit. So it begins. So I like to think about this as a generalized effort that's taking place across like debates and discussions in a really, really interesting and complicated context, again, which is happening literally as we're trying to sort of clean up the end of a giant world war. We're trying to grapple with the realizations about the Nazi death machines and all of these kinds of things that the world is grappling with, and trying to figure out, okay, where do we go from here, right? So it's a very interesting moment in world history for so many reasons. And so you have an effort to find, what will be the useful foundations that can bring everybody on board. Because what we have to recognize is the establishment of the UDHR, for all of its problems and all the criticisms that are deserved, you're going to be hard pressed to find another moment in the history of the world where that such consensus was reached across culture, across region, across all of these sorts of things. And that's what I'll come back to in a moment. So, but at first, they were searching for the kinds of answers that you suggested, Josh. So like, where can we find the commonalities in philosophy? Where can we find the commonalities across religion and faith? Where can we find the commonalities? And it's not to say they didn't find them. They exist. Particularly when we look at the consistencies across like our key monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, right? There are undeniable, and there's all kinds of sociological reasons for this, parallels, right, in those frameworks for morality, for kind of a view of human life and human civilization. However, the problem with that as a foundation is that is based on faith, right? It's based on something other than mutually observable evidence, or
Sure.
sort of mutually agreed upon arguments that we can kind of have out in the open. And so while there are commonalities, there's a problem with using religion as a basis, because first of all, it assumes everyone is going to have those beliefs or have a religion at all. And second of all, those tend to break down once there is a point of conflict or disagreement. Because if I say, well, it's this way because my God, and you say it's this way because your God, we're really in a troublesome place. It's a very difficult, and this is the same reason why we in sociology don't deal in a currency of faith, but only in evidence, right? Is because you can't really you kind of hit a stopping point there in the pursuit of knowledge. So they ended up kind of bailing on some of those early notions of foundation, even though it's built into the conversation, right? It's certainly built into the building of what the rights would be, and the building of like what would people really most value and respect. However, at the end of the day, and this is, we lean on scholars like Jack Donnelly. He was one of the guys that I had an opportunity, one of the people I had an opportunity to learn from at UConn, who was a visiting professor at the time. He's one of the top scholars in the history of the field. He and others who kind of came up with this UDHR model. And the notion is that, the foundation for these rights is actually consensus itself. That we recognize that there's never been another time that so many people in the world agree that there should be fundamental rights for human beings, and that this list, right, should be those rights. And in fact, for all of the cultural relativism that we could discuss, the extent to which these rights can only really be understood and metabolized through a cultural lens. And I could give examples of that if you want here in a minute. You actually pointed some out in your comments on abortion. Generally speaking, when you go around the world and ask people, as many pollsters have done, there's general agreement on these rights. And so the notion is like the basis is consensus itself, the foundation, with the understanding that we also have the freedom to change those things if that consensus changes. Right. And that's why the UN is an organic body, right? And it operates like many legislative bodies would in the General Assembly, and can consider amendments and changes and additions and all of those kinds of things. So at the end of the day, Josh, the foundation for human rights is an ongoing construction of consensus and agreement in the global community around those rights.
Wow. So
I know that was long-winded. Sorry, fam. I just wanted to give you the real answer, the full answer.
Dude, no, it was really good. I loved it.
Yeah. This is great. I I am curious though about what the agreements within the UN that focus around human rights, because like what happens if a country violates it?
Okay.
I mean, or like, and maybe, and I don't know if this is related to human rights or not, although I feel like it is, but the recent whatever verdict from the UN against Israel, and the genocide thing. So maybe, if it is applicable, maybe you can kind of help unpack that so we can
It
kind
is
of
absolutely applicable. It is
Okay,
absolutely applicable, and it's you're getting to one of the reasons that I entered this field, because you're recognizing something that my students recognize, that many in the world recognize, and that you'll see in the first page of our book, which is human rights have done a great job in existing in theory, but in practice has been a problem. And this largely has to do with the way that our international legal system assumes that states, whether it's the United States, China, Russia, any of these states, are able and willing at all times to prioritize their international legal obligations above all other priorities, including perceived geopolitical interest, capital accumulation or capital interest, colonial and imperial ambitions, all of these kinds of things, right? And as we argue in our work, but we took a very long time for our work to be accepted in the field because it's quite critical of human rights scholarship and human rights as it exists for the reason you're giving, right? We're now accepted in all these kinds of things, but that took many years, as my co-author and authors can tell you. But as we argue, that is kind of the central problem in enforcement and why these things don't happen. But let me back up and talk about how it's supposed to work. So there's some. So first of all, we have to understand, like, why did the UN come into? Why was the UN created in the first place? And one of the really fundamental reasons it was created was, frankly, just to keep us from blowing ourselves off the planet in a new conflict. I mean, really, we can talk about, establishing Western hegemony and all those things, and it was absolutely doing that. I mean, for sure, there is certainly credence to that criticism. However, the UN was really centrally created in order to give the world options diplomatically to solve problems and kind of a set of rules to prevent problems before people go to blows, right? Before these countries start trying to annihilate each other again, and then we're into a nuclear crisis, right? And so when you look at the sort of the structure of the UN, it reflects that in many ways. So who did they give permanent veto power to in the Security Council? Well, they gave it to the major nuclear powers at the time. Because again, like, what are you trying to prevent? You're trying to prevent a nuclear apocalypse. So if there's anybody that's going to have a veto power on any of the decisions, it's going to be those major nuclear powers, right? So United States, Russia, well, then the Soviet Union, now Russia, right? China, Great Britain, France. So it's built into the structure, right? That they were trying to prevent a full-scale catastrophic war following the horrors of World War II, right? So the other problem with that is, can you really create enforcement, like proper coercive enforcement?
Yeah.
UN forces coming in, making you do a thing or whatever. Can you do that with nuclear powers that you're trying to convince? No, right? You're going to run into huge issues there. Not to mention, you're going to deal with them like saying, oh, but you're violating our national sovereignty, right? So another issue with human rights international law is this constant tension between the unquestionable sovereignty of a nation and the limitations of international legal obligations. So whenever, especially a powerful state like the United States or China or some others are sloughing off their human rights and other international legal obligations, that's usually the claim that they're going to use, that they're going to make in arguing why they have to do that, right? Is, well, this is in our national security, and to abide by these obligations would be a violation of our, of that sovereignty. Now, the United States also does something very interesting. We are unique in the fact that we included a footnote. See, on all three of those instruments that we ratified, the United States included a footnote in that ratification. And we are alone in the world in using this footnote in the way that we do.
USA.
Right? Because it's only the most, because it's only because we claim to be the king of the hill. It's because it's this notion of American exceptionalism, right? So we sign on to this new order while simultaneously telling the world, well, we are actually not going to be held by this order the way you are. And the reason is because this order is based on us to begin with. We are the shining city on the hill. You are going to tell us how to do democracy? You're going to tell us how to do rights and freedom? No. We'll tell you. So we create the International Criminal Court later under Clinton and elsewhere to try war criminals. But we say we're not obligated to it. You can't try our people under the ICC, right? Under these instruments, we sign with a special reservation that the quote is, it's not self-executing. And what that means in real terms is that this counts when we say it counts. Y'all can yell at us all you want, but unless we say we're in violation of it, this instrument is not self-executing. We have to execute it. But we are alone in the world in giving ourselves that privilege, right? So this is this notion of American exceptionalism that also pervades international law and international relations. So again, to finish up answering your actual questions that are going on these tangents, it's supposed to work through the sort of what we call naming and shaming. So under all these instruments, anyone who ratifies them, what you're doing is you're also agreeing to the optional protocol that you will be reviewed every however many years, depending on the instrument, usually they're 4 years, by all the other countries on the commission. So for example, under ICCPR, right, under CAT, we are reviewed every 4 years by all of the other nations that are seated that year on the Human Rights Committee, right, on this 47 nation body under the UN. And it is a very thorough process where the nation being reviewed gives a statement on how they're doing according to those obligations. Everyone else gets to come in and give their criticisms and here's how we think you're doing on these obligations. And that includes, by the way, people like myself inside that country. They're called civil society reviews. So they'll also ask people like me to do write-ups on how we're doing according to human rights obligations and all that. And then the United States gets a chance to rebut, so the State Department is who does all this. So they'll come in and have a chance to rebut those reviews. And then there's a final kind of statement by the broader, 47 nation commission that sort of lays down law. Here's how you did, and here's how you're doing right now on these obligations. Here's what you're doing poorly. So it has like positive stuff, neutral stuff, negative stuff. And you can look up all of our prior reviews under this system. Like you can very easily look up on the United Nations all of our prior reviews under all three of those instruments, right? And it's real interesting stuff too for anyone who wants to get into that. Now,
that is really interesting.
Yeah. So that's how it's supposed to work. Now, to keep in mind, there are also regional human rights regimes. So the EU, right, the European Union has their own regional regime. The OAS, Organization of American States, the African Union. So there are additional enforcement mechanisms that are a little bit more heavy at the regional. So, for example, in Europe, if you are too far afoul of human rights obligations, you actually threatens your status as an EU member.
Really?
Right?
Oh my gosh.
Yes. But we don't have that in the Americas. Right. So that is different in these different sort of regional orders when it comes to international law. And that's kind of getting pretty complicated, but let me know how much into the weeds you want me to go. I have a sense you want to go in the direction of Israel and how this stuff actually works or doesn't work, but I'll let you take the lead here.
Yeah. So on that Israel thing, because I am somewhat fascinated by it because one thing you mentioned did click with me, because I'm just like, why is like George Clooney's wife, involved in this whole in this whole
No,
thing? And then
it's real.
I did some research and I was like, okay, that tracks, but also, like, when it comes to like genocide and the language used by their report, I mean, who decides whether or not a Palestinian child picking up an unexploded IDF soldier's grenade that gets killed, like if that is a mark against Israel, or
Sure.
a mark just against, I don't know, just wartime stuff, like it just
Sure.
maybe make me better understand why they decided that what Israel was doing is considered a genocide.
Sure. So I want to really provide some solid information, because I think there's a lot of people that are lost on that, right? So how are these decisions made? What kind of work goes into making those decisions and all of that, right? So one of the groups of people that are going to be involved in this kind of things are folks, and you'll see this, and it's in French, right? Special rapporteur, right? But it's a special reporter, right? It's all it is. It is an area expert whose job it is to investigate claims, investigate ongoing crises, investigate issues in the region of their expertise and of assignment. And so you have special rapporteurs on the Palestinian sort of occupied territories. You have special rapporteurs on the general region. You have special rapporteurs on that specific issue of genocide or issues of apartheid and these other kinds of issues that have come up. So these are the sort of data collectors. These are the information collectors. These are the investigators. These are right, and they have a role to play. Now you also have the courts, and there are essentially two international courts. One is the ICJ. The ICJ is an actual body of the United Nations that has existed since its inception. And the ICJ, you can understand, is part of that UN effort to keep peace, right, and the peace and stability and security in the world, because the ICJ's job is to handle beefs between nation states. That's what they do. They don't try individuals for war crimes. They don't do any of that stuff. Their only job is to mediate conflicts of states. And the reason is obvious, right? To prevent war, to prevent what we see happening now, right? All of these kinds of things. And so any member state to the ICJ can bring a case to the court for consideration. And then the court can either take up just like the Supreme Court, the court can either take up the case or not, right? But if the court takes it up, then they then are charged with making decisions that are intended to mediate whatever that issue or conflict is. So one example that I use in classes that just get us away from the Gaza thing, just so you see how this works in general, is like, so there's a classic case where like Ecuador took Colombia to the ICJ because as part of the drug war that Colombia was fighting with us, they sprayed pesticides all over all the all over the jungles that were growing coca and all this kind of stuff. And one of the problems that happened was that a lot of that leached into the groundwater and leached into all the drinking water. And so, some of its neighbors like Ecuador and elsewhere were, downstream from all that. And, just obviously not so happy about their country being polluted by those efforts. And so here's a case where they brought that case to the ICJ. The ICJ comes in and mediates. Colombia, this is what you got to do. You can't poison all their water, all of this kind of stuff. So that's how that works. Now, in this case, in the case of Israel, you had two cases brought to the ICJ. One was on claims of apartheid, which is absolutely in violation of international law every which way. And by the way, Israel is absolutely an ethno-state. Israel is absolutely practicing apartheid. There is no question about that, according to any remaining experts. Anyone pretending that is a debate is frankly misinformed. Just have to say that flat out. This is not a political question anymore. It is an objective question, and there is no debate among experts. Similarly, a case was brought to the ICJ by South Africa, but now it's also been joined by many, many other states, claiming that Israel is committing acts of genocide. Now, I do, for anyone that wants to look into it, I highly, highly suggest that people download and actually read the South African case in the ICJ on genocide. And you can also read the findings of the ICJ on that case, where they found plausible acts of genocide being committed. And you will get not only the definition of genocide under international law, but you will get granular level evidence from all of these kinds of tools and folks that we've been discussing on those claims in that reporting of the intent, of the actual intent to commit genocide, which is usually the most difficult thing to prove. But in Israel's case, frankly, y'all, this is the first live stream genocide. I mean, frankly, the arguments about where's the intent are nonsensical. Nonsensical. I mean, this is the first time we have, in real time, soldiers committing war crimes and broadcasting and celebrating them. Everything from literally dancing around in the lingerie of their sexual and murderous victims. I mean, we are seeing levels of depravity in the IDF and in this genocidal campaign that are absolutely unique in the history of the world. And so, not to go too far down that rabbit hole, but again, to answer your question, all of this is part of that ICJ process for investigating these issues once that's brought to the court to do so. And they are continuing to document these issues in terms of genocide and apartheid as we speak, because it'll be another couple of years before they come down with their final sort of finding. The preliminary finding is what I referred to earlier.
So I would love for you to dig into that a little bit more, because there seems to be a lot of confusion. I will look, I'll just be on Facebook, of course, right? Or Instagram, whatever social media. And I have one person, posting about all the, terrible things Hamas is doing, the terrible things that the way that Hamas is basically keeping this genocide going, or whatever it is. And then I'll see something about how Israel is perpetrating all these things. And how do I, as just a normal guy in Virginia, tell the difference between these two stories and these two narratives? Go into that a little bit. What is this process like with the ICJ? How do they determine the evidence and all of that? And why isn't there more outrage? Maybe there is, and I'm just not seeing it. But why isn't there more outrage if this unbelievable genocide is happening?
Well, let me say
what's going on.
Yeah, sure. Let me say a couple things. So first of all, I'll speak to the outrage. That outrage exists. We are absolutely alone in the world. This is probably the most isolating, since the war in Iraq, this is the most isolating, damaging decision that the United States has made for its standing in the world in modern history. This will probably be, the war in Iraq, is considered the nail in the coffin for American empire. This will be the coup de grace, right? In terms of people being done with American hegemony in the world and no longer believing in American leadership or anything we say about that rules-based order. And how could they? As we fuel a genocide, as we say, no, there's no, because there's also these other rules, like the responsibility to intervene in a genocide. Not only is it illegal, obviously, to perpetuate it, to arm it, to support it, to give it diplomatic cover, to do all the things that we do in our connections to Israel, but there's also an actual legal obligation to intervene, to jump in and stop it. And in fact, if you ask the Houthis why they've been bombing in the Red Sea and threatening shipping lanes and all that, they have been clear every time. We are abiding by our responsibility to intervene in what international courts have declared as a genocide. Our rules. We made those rules. And in fact, we've used those rules to argue that our own military adventurism in the war on terror was justified. We're there to protect women. We're there to fight terrorists. We're there. This is our responsibility to protect and to intervene. Completely hypocritical. I mean, manifestly hypocritical. And the world is not dumb. And to show how alone we are, look at vote after vote after vote in the General Assembly over the last year. We are alone over and over and over and over again. The world wants not just a ceasefire, an arms embargo. By the way, the U.S. population also wants that. So 60% of all voters in the United States want not a ceasefire, an arms embargo. And make no mistake, a single phone call would end this campaign. A single phone call from our administration saying you stop or the guns and money end. War's over. If there's no United States, there is no IDF. Period. Now, we're not the only ones that fund and arm them. But if you took us out of play, it's game over. And not just for their military nonsense and their apartheid and their repression of those in the occupied territories and this horrific genocidal campaign, but their economy itself is also dependent on us and on all kinds of secondary labor forces that they bring in from elsewhere and use Palestinians to do. I want to come back to that. I think what I think is the heart of your question is like, where should people be looking for this, and how do you know like who to believe in all of that? So the other kind of frustrating thing about this, to be honest with you, is one thing that I would do is you're looking at that those kinds of contrasting arguments is who's making the argument. Because here's the thing, just like with climate change, for those whose job it is to do these things, there is no argument. There's only arguments among people who have no business making those calls. I would invite you to find a single expert listened to by anyone outside of Israel that will say this is not a genocidal campaign. You cannot find them. And now, whether or not other people make TikToks about what they believe or want others to believe are going on, I could give two shits about that. Right? And it's the same thing as asking me about your heart surgery. I'm not a cardiac surgeon. I may have an opinion about it, but why would you listen to that? Right? Yeah. So similarly, I would ask, if you want to know what's going on with regard to this genocidal campaign, you have to ask those whose job it is to make that call. Whether that's the ICJ, the special rapporteurs, any number of human rights organizations inside and outside of the region, other states, the list goes on and on and on and on and on. And again, what you're going to find is among those whose job it is to do this, there is no disagreement. And so that's for folks like me, that's the frustration, right? Because then we find ourselves having to argue with smoke, right? It's arguing people's fears and opinions and platforming of propaganda. And there's been a lot of that. So, to be fair, the United States and Israel has been engaged in a ton of informational control and propaganda with regard to this. So there's a reason that Americans and Israelis are wildly misinformed. Netanyahu has been campaigning directly to the American public in English over and over and over again. And then he waits to the Super Bowl for a bombing campaign while you're not paying attention. Right? Then he comes right back to talk to you in English, say, don't worry. Right? And if you hear the kinds of things he says, and I got to tell you, there's folks on the right that are sick of this too. And it's more of this like sort of autonomy issue, right? Where he's telling you as an American who you got to be afraid of and who you got to want to kill and who you got to want to spend monies to kill, or these kinds of things. Not asking Americans at all, like, well, is that even real? Why would an American be worried about Palestinians? They're not threatening us. In fact, we have tons of Palestinian communities living right beside us in the United States today. They're not a threat to us. They're a threat to you, to your brutality, to your regime. And like anyone in the history of the world that commits settler colonial violence and apartheid and slavery and things like that, they're of course afraid that those that they have put under their boot will eventually turn on them. And that happened on October 7th.
Bill, I am curious though, like, you basically said, okay, the world is looking at the United States with a bit of a side eye, like, what the heck are you doing? But like, how does that sort of balance with what we're doing in Ukraine, or at least, how we're supporting Ukraine? Is it like a wash, like, okay, you suck over here, but at least over here you're doing something good?
So now we get into the complexity of things, and then more into my book, right? So, and this is exactly the kind of thing that we get into in the book, is like, why do we see these kinds of things happening? And why do we see states like the United States playing the role that they do relative to these conflicts and all of that? And I would even add, it also tells us why both parties are backing these kinds of military interventions, even though their own constituencies don't want them. Like, you got to ask yourself that question, fam. Like, that means there's something else going on here. And so for us, in our work, we talk about this, and I have to thank, other scholars like William Robinson and others, that we're also using in our work to do so. But this notion of the global police state. So this rules-based order that really became the kind of framework for global capitalism also requires a repressive apparatus. And that repressive apparatus is, of course, provided by states in their militaries. But not all states play the same roles in that need of capital to discipline the rest of us, to keep labor in line, to police the lines between those who are just exploitable and those who are actually expropriable, people who are colonized, women, racialized populations, slaves, and these sorts of folks, but also as a source of accumulation itself, so that war is a business, right? That as capital, as our owning class across the world has become flush with cash, but not a whole lot of places to put it for a good return on their investment in the productive economy, war becomes the only remaining place to get those top dollar investment returns. So what role do we play in all of that as a nation? Well, the United States is at the center of that global police state. Now, why? One of the reasons why is because we are the only ones with the sort of military infrastructure capable of doing so. We're the only ones with 750 plus military bases all over the world. China, our closest military competitor, has one. They're working on two, right? So we play a very particular role for the global owning class in terms of that repressive apparatus and in terms of that militarized accumulation and the global military industrial complex. And by the way, to give you an idea of how serious that militarized accumulation is, just as a little background, so all of our DoD spending, all of our defense spending, all of our contracted spending, because most of that goes to contractors, right, goes to 5 companies, 5 multinational or transnational corporations. And that's folks like Lockheed, Raytheon, all these guys, right? Just this week in Responsible Statecraft, there was an article done on just how profitable investment in those companies has been since October 7th. What do you think those returns look like as a percentage for those that invested in some of those top firms? What do you think the numbers look like for return on investment in 1 year?
Gosh, I have no. I mean, I try to follow Nancy.
30%.
Not even close.
I try to follow Nancy Pelosi's portfolio.
Oh yeah, you follow you follow on whales.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna say, I don't know, 50%.
So in Responsible Statecraft, and I forget which company was which, but one of the top 5 was 55%. And then the next one, the ones that make the bunker buster bombs, the 2,000 pounds bombs, their rate on return in this past year was 85%.
What? I'm in the wrong business.
This is the business of global murder, right? I mean, make no mistake. Like this is exactly what you think it is. This is all of the ugliness that we talk about in terms of the business of warfare. And it's not just that. So anyone who's a fan of like Naomi Klein's work and like shock doctrine and things like this, the money just in the military industrial complex is just part of it. What about all the contracts to rebuild? Have you taken a look at who's in charge of Ukraine?
No,
right?
I know I
Is it
haven't.
Hunter Biden?
Handed it over to big finance, handed it over to Goldman Sachs, handed it over to all these big bankers who are going to run the financing of the recovery efforts in Ukraine. It's all for sale. It's all for capital accumulation. It's all to produce more and more opportunities for investment for an owning class that is holding on to too much cash and nowhere to put it. Because they ain't giving it back to us. That's for sure. Because we're seeing wealth disparity just skyrocket year over year. That's on the national level and at the global level. And so this is what we're seeing. Yeah.
This is my last question. I know Will's gonna close us out here after that. I'm just wondering, what should I do, like, in my home? I'm hearing this. It breaks my heart to think about. I mean, I'm a pastor. I follow Jesus. Jesus was executed by the Roman state, the empire of his time.
Yeah.
And violence is very profitable. I can see that. I can understand that. But I hear this and I don't know what to do about it. I don't know if there's anything I can do about it except feel bad or feel like, man, it sucks to be an American, or it's great to be an American. I mean,
So let me speak to that.
Go ahead. I'd love to hear.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I absolutely know what you mean, and this is something that it's something I deal with my students, right? Because we talk about in this classroom all the time, and these problems of the world, and those are some pretty heavy stuff, right? And so there's a lot of that we have to kind of grapple with in the classroom, and so with the young adults and other folks that I teach, and so we take this on. I would just encourage a couple of things. So first thing, I would separate the people of our country with the ruling and owning classes that are making a majority of these decisions. And by the way, I included Republicans and Democrats in that, because again, that 60% number that I told about is across party. Same if we look at like those who want things like cheap and affordable healthcare for everybody. Generally speaking, people agree. If we ask people, should there be more wealth redistribution in this country? Like, should the wealthy be a little less wealthy and everyone else have a little bit more on their plate? Everybody agrees to that. Again, and the rest of the world understands these things too, right? That our people and our sort of authority structure are not necessarily the same. And that's the same in Russia, and that's the same in China, and that's the same, right? That is almost a universal. So that's one thing that we have to remember, right? And that also guides my sort of solutions and answers to this. So one of the things that we're talking about in the book, and there's lots of things that give me hope, but this is just one of them. One place where we see some really interesting movement, and this is across party, this is across race, this is also across gender and age and some other things in some really interesting ways, is our growing union movement, the growing labor movement, right? And what we're seeing there is everyday people across party, across some of these other things, coming to agreements around, should we still be fighting this war in Ukraine? Should we be backing Israel in these kinds of things? Is this actually in the benefit of our constituents? Is this actually in the benefit of labor? Is this actually in the benefit of our families, our communities, and these sorts of things? And you're starting to see some very interesting stuff there. So there has been a labor for ceasefire movement on Gaza that's done things like have port workers organize and say, we're not gonna ship stuff out of the port for this war effort. You want to send them ammunition? Not through us. This kind of stuff. You're starting to see, so after the big UAW win, and we talk about this in the conclusion of the book, after the big UAW win, they got really involved in this as well, and they've actually started internal kinds of conversations that we'll see I think it'll be another few years before we see the real sort of results of this, but you're starting to see the unions, the major unions, reconsider these historical decisions to stay out of foreign policy, to stay out of these other policy arenas. And what they're realizing is that their interests are hugely impacted by those foreign policy and other policy decisions, and they're starting to mount up in those efforts. And I think that is going to be a big shift. And that is a huge way that everyday people like you and I can get involved, is in building that power of everyday people through union and labor organizing and other organizing of that sort, such that we can become more involved in the major decisions that impact our lives and the lives of others around the world. Because right now, I mean, one thing I think lots of people can agree on across party is all of us don't feel like we have a lot of voice in the world and in the decisions that are impacting our lives, our families, and our communities. And people respond to that in different ways, but I think that is a commonality amongst everyday people.
Bill, I gotta say, I need to have more human rights people on the show because I'm like what's funny, or maybe not funny, is, and this is sort of inside baseball just for our audience, is like we give questions to each of our guests ahead of time. We're not a gotcha show or anything. So like we just discuss and just make sure, hey, are these questions good? Are these within your wheelhouse? And like I gave you a whole list of like 10, and I'm looking, and normally like I check them off like as we ask the question, and like none of my questions are checked off. like basically we didn't touch on any of the things that I'd sent you, which just means you got to come back.
Well, I'd love, if you can give me a moment, I'd love to plug the book.
Oh, no, absolutely. This is the plug the book and everything that you're all about section. So go ahead.
If you want to know more about this stuff, please check out Human Rights Praxis and the Struggle for Survival by myself and my co-author, Davida Sofan-Glassberg. So we talk about all of these things in great depth. And if you want to understand any of these things, again, at a greater level of depth, and if you're interested in some of these questions and why human rights work or don't work, and how these sort of global power issues are working, about the global police state, about all of these, about Israel, about Sudan, we didn't even talk about Africa, about Sudan, the DRC, about the geopolitical race between the United States and China and BRICS and others. We get into all of these things throughout the book, and you can get it on Amazon. You can get it on Routledge. And I'm happy to send you all over some discount codes if you like, if you want to share those with your audience. But we'd love it if folks could get the book, give us some reviews, and we'd love to hear from you as well. But I also want to say, Josh and Will, this has really been fun, y'all. I really enjoyed it, and I'd love to come back anytime to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. And I really love what y'all are doing, and I really appreciate also, Josh, as a pastor, you being real honest about like, hey, these are sort of my moral and ethical commitments, and I love that that's part of the conversation, right? And I love what y'all are doing. Thank you. Of course.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bill. Oh, and how can people reach you? Like, where are you at on the socials?
Sure. So the best way to follow me actually is I still run our human rights Twitter account. So it's at SJSU Human Rights, at SJSU Human Rights on X or Twitter or whatever people want to call it. I'm not a big social media guy, otherwise, to the bane of many people around me's existence, but it's just kind of a choice that I make. Keeps me more productive, keeps me a little more sane. That's the best way to get a hold of me. And also, if you DM me on there, I can get back to you with any questions or any other contact information. No problem.
Awesome. That's great. And I will make sure that I put all those links and stuff in the show notes. And those coupon codes. Yeah, I'm sure our audience would eat that up, save a couple ducats.
Yeah, I'll email it to you when we get out. If you order on Amazon, it applies it automatically. But on the the Routledge site and other sites, I think you need the code. So I'll shoot that your way.
Okay, cool. Well, hey, thanks again for everything, and to our audience and listeners, thank you again for showing up and learning something along with the rest of us. And remember, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care, folks. Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Hey there, Josh Burtram here, faithful host of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I want to let you know about a compelling new spinoff, the Faith Roundtable, where I'll be interviewing top faith leaders, theologians, and scholars to unpack the pressing issues that are shaping the church in America today. We'll dive into topics like faith in public life, social justice, and how we can engage our communities more effectively. Make sure you don't miss any of our enlightening conversations by subscribing to it on our YouTube channel. Join me at the Faith Roundtable, where deep discussion meets thoughtful insight.